So today I'm joined by Sarah Hickson, photographer and leasehold cladding building safety EWS1 victim as well. So welcome to Building Safety Faces, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Matt. Good to be here.
Excellent. So can you talk through? I mean, we just were chatting before we started recording about creating a social documentary, and this is where we first started talking on a bit of a chat, I think, about EWS1, and then we got into your photography work, and those two worlds collided, which we can talk about in a second. But on the professional front, so what's the difference between? I think I rudely called you a photojournalist, and you put me right on that. So what's the difference? What's social documentary through photography? How does that work?
Well, it's not at all rude to suggest that I'm a photojournalist. It's just, for me, it's more about the speed with which I work, I suppose, and the kind of stories that I engage with, where I'm really interested in human stories, human narratives behind the scenes, if you like. So I tend to work on a project over a longer period of time, and that allows you to build up trust, really get under the surface of a story, get to know people, and draw things out through images that you might otherwise not see. And that's the way I love to work. So whether I'm doing that very locally, as I've been doing during the pandemic, through images around my local area during lockdown, or whether it's about working in far off places in North Africa in the desert, or West Africa, or India, or working on refugee projects in different places. My approach is fairly similar. Yeah.
Wow, and our conversation really, we got into this was sort of saying we're moving through a moment in history now in this country of awful moment post Grenfell, and that's become this building safety crisis, and there are so many amazing people involved in this scandal that we sort of started chatting about. Could we record some of that with beautiful photography, in the way that we've got a record on Twitter or blogs, or that the written word, maybe quite a lot of video, but very little amazing photography. So that's where we sort of started talking about this whole subject. And talk us through what happened once you got going with that.
Well, it all happened very quickly. As you say, you and I were talking initially about EWS1 and the whole situation, and then we got into a conversation about my work, my photography, and it just kind of evolved quite organically, as a lot of these things do. And within a few days, literally just 10 days before Christmas, I guess it was, I ended up going down the river east to one of the locations where there's a big scandal brewing, and had arranged to meet a few of the residents there. And I literally had that day like a window of about an hour and a quarter, because of the light going by 3, and the rain came in as well. So I just met with a couple of residents in this particular block, had some conversations. At that point, they didn't even know that I was also directly impacted on the situation. So of course, that was another bonding element. But just trying to kind of take pictures at that point that were about trying to find something about that person's personality that also reflected the situation that they were in and the location. So giving a kind of context and a picture. How does a picture sum up all that? And it was the day actually that then the new restrictions got announced, and so it was then very difficult to do any more at that point. But it's something that I really want to come back to, because I think, the story is going to roll on, and we're not, things are moving very fast, but I don't think we're at a solution yet. So there'll be people with stories to tell and situations that are difficult going forward.
And I think, is that one of the challenges with, obviously we can do a video interview like this, and you can, over a period of 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you can get to know somebody, you can understand the context, but actually with trying to convey a lot of that information in a still image is, I would imagine, exceptionally difficult. Well, a lot of people might think it's quite easy, but actually to get that one shot that people can interpret. I mean, how many shots would you need to take typically to get that one that is the one you end up choosing?
Yeah, It really varies. It depends partly what the image is going to be used for, and often it's the hardest thing is finding, as you say, that one image. You know, you might have a combination of 3 or 5 or 10 that would tell the story, but to find one that encapsulates all of that. And I tend to work very instinctively, in the sense that I don't plan out in advance where or how I might be taking the shots. I'll go very much with the flow. For example, where I went to take these shots before Christmas, I'd never been to this particular location. I didn't know what it looked like. I didn't, although I knew it was on the river, but beyond that, I didn't know. I didn't know what the weather was going to be like. You know, we had sunshine, we had rain. You have to just go with the flow and feel what emerges in the moment. I tend to do a lot of walking and talking, and we just find the right space, because from that you then see where somebody feels comfortable, where they suddenly look good, where the light works. Just keeping moving, and the right thing will emerge. Usually, I just trust the process. And sometimes when you're doing it in your head, you think, "Yeah, that was the image." Sometimes that will absolutely be the one. Other times you might be really surprised when you look back at the edit and you just go, "Ah, I had no idea actually that it would be that one, but that's the one." And sometimes it's not the most perfect image, but it's just got something about it emotionally that makes you look again, that draws you back and makes you kind of go, there's something there.
And I guess the sort of the process of walking with the person, if it's a subject that you're dealing with, and actually talking to them again, I guess it makes more sense to you as in terms of the story, does it? In terms of the how might I want to sort of capture that as a photograph? You know what?
Yes, because I think what happens then is that you allow, what I love doing is working very collaboratively with the people that I'm photographing. So I don't come with a pre and post idea. I allow that to emerge so that they feel also that they're in control of things in a more collaborative way. And generally then they're more relaxed, because also meeting a photographer sometimes is, you know, it puts people on edge. They're not sure how to be. Suddenly, if you're just kind of walking and allowing them to guide you, then you start to see, as a photographer, you start to see that person emerge, and you start to see their own personality and characteristics, and that tends to work for me.
Yeah, and I think probably people watching this probably wouldn't expect to be looking at a conversation about photography in
No.
the context of the building safety crisis, or the cladding crisis, or whatever we want to call it. But I think one of the things to me is that, you know, I like lots of different things to think about, and I get bored very easily. So this really sort of captured my attention, in the sense of looking at communication and saying what are the means of communication that could land here, what could make a difference, and really what, to my mind, the how do we convey the human impact and the human story that sits behind all of this? Because, you know, talking about cavity barriers and cladding systems and cool therm K15 and Kingspan, and it is pretty boring. You know, if people weren't impacted by this, they probably wouldn't want to engage in the conversation. So
Absolutely.
how do we put something out there that, you know, a person that isn't impacted stops in their tracks and thinks, yeah, I need to write to my MP, or I need to follow somebody on Twitter, or I need to listen next time I hear a story on the radio and maybe do something about it? Or how do we change perceptions? What have you done as sort of in your career that has sort of had that impact, maybe in a different context, maybe that people have really really landed?
I guess a lot of the work that I've done with asylum seekers, refugees, has done that, where actually you're showing a different, particularly at the peak of you know, a few years ago, where there was a lot of attention on what was going on in Calais, in the jungle, and there was a lot of negative press and a lot of really untruthful headlines and media stories. That grouped everybody together. You didn't see any individual stories. It was very easy to make sweeping generalizations. And I think a lot of the work that I did a particular story around music and musicians and a recording in the Calais jungle, where we set up a temporary recording studio and found musicians within the camp who were living there, who brought their own songs, made instruments, told stories, and then we made an album. And so I was kind of the sort of behind the scenes photographer on that project. And when you're embedded in that way, and people are being seen as themselves and telling their own stories and making their own music and sharing that in a very kind of very different environment to what you might expect to see in a refugee camp. That immediately draws people's attentions and allows you to tell a story in a very different way that people can relate to.
Yeah,
I think it's that. Yeah.
I think one of the things, and why I keep always sort of coming back to this human connection, is that I think when people in power sort of say, "Oh, campaigners are doing this," or leaseholders, it dehumanizes in the very sense when you start talking about families and homes and hopes and dreams and health and things like that. It's all of a sudden you put a face on it, you make it human, you remove that desensitization. And I think at the moment, one of the observations I've had is that, especially when it comes to policymakers, is that their minds are often changed when they make the human connection. And sometimes you've got to try that a lot more than with an average person, because they are kind of desensitized by the job that they're in. You know, they deal with a lot of gnarly issues. So how do you work
to hide behind that? Yeah. And I think the key for a lot of these issues, and I think a lot of what draws me to a lot of stories, is where our human vulnerability and fragility is exposed, because we all feel that at different points in our lives. You know, we're all vulnerable, and when you see that in somebody else, in a situation that you never imagined could happen to somebody like me, or somebody like my parents, or somebody like my children, or whatever our own situations are, when you see that fragility and that vulnerability, then that's when we connect. And that's when we go, well, this is an outrage. This is shocking. How are we allowing this to happen? How is it possible that we're hiding behind these headlines and say, we can't change this. We can't allow these people in. We can't find the people who are responsible for these escalating costs, or for changing the regulations, or whatever it is. That's where the change happens.
I mean, with you know, sometimes it's not happening as much now, but originally there would be quite a few people that would come onto social media or newspapers and say they should have done a survey before they bought the building. You know, there's risk associated with everything. It's their problem to fit. And you sort of think, well, no, because it was probably by accident that you as a writer aren't in that situation. Maybe you're in social housing, so someone else is picking up the bill, you know, through the housing association, or maybe you bought a house rather than a flat, so you've got a freehold. Maybe you live with your parents, or whatever it is. It's the reason I'm not personally caught up in the cladding scandal, the building safety scandal, is because I bought a house. I could easily have bought an apartment, in which case I'd be suffering as well. So I sort of look at this and think, this is everybody's problem. Maybe that's just my way of looking at the world, but you know, I'm not one for this sort of I'm all right, Jack, sod the rest. You know, it's very much a question of there is a problem here. It's societal. Exactly. There are some people that are more impacted by this than a lot of others, but surely we all need to work together to solve the problem.
Well, that's it. I mean, in the end, all of these things come down to what kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of communities do we want to belong to? How do we, you know, where is that social justice? Where are our values? And they're things that we should share, right? And those are things that, you know, politicians and a democratic society is there we vote for those things, and those things that we believe in. And those injustices need to be looked at, and they do belong to all of us. Not just, yeah, I'm all right, Jack, so I'm going to turn my back on that because that might cost me a little bit more in my taxes. But actually everything that we do, you know, the principles of how we live are based on these.
Yeah, and I think if everybody was a direct beneficiary of every part of the tax that they pay, then it wouldn't work, would it? That's the point. You know, the contributions of the many pay for the requirements of the few, whether that's insurance, whether it's taxation, whatever it is. You know, if everybody takes out more than they put in, the maths don't work. You know, and I think that's what we need to understand, that we've sort of inverted that now and sort of saying, well, you know, all of the failings through the regulatory regime or society, whatever, call it what you will, governments over years that we've put there, has led to a failing. And now effectively the logic is one of, well, let's just make the people that happen to be holding the particular baby at that moment in time pay the bill. You know, if you sold the flat 2 years ago, you've got away with it, but that was luck. That wasn't by design. You know, that was
absolutely. And meanwhile, let's not forget that there are a lot of people making a lot of money out of this. You know, there are development companies, construction companies, people with shares in these businesses, people getting huge bonuses. The profits are enormous, right? So that's the other side of it, you know, where there's a real inequality there.
Yeah, I kind of hoped, and I don't know whether it's still an unrealistic dream, but I just kind of hoped that there would be a negotiated settlement that sort of worked for, you know, where everybody walked away feeling a bit bruised. But that typically is where the right line is. When nobody's happy, you've probably got to the right solution. But at the moment, just to turn around and lazily sort of say, well, legally it's the leaseholder's problem, and oh, and by the way, we'll make it affordable for you by doing some kind of 30-year loan scheme, doesn't seem to have anything approaching justice, doesn't seem to be at all fair.
No. And of course it's highlighted the whole kind of system of leasehold, which I think a lot of people have never really understood. And even myself, I suppose, technically I understood it, what it meant, you know, and the relationship between the leaseholder and the freeholder. But it's not until you actually get to this point, you kind of go, well, my goodness, I've been paying into this mortgage, thinking that I was buying, you know, putting this money into something that was going to have some value and was going to maintain its value, broadly speaking. And then suddenly understanding that actually you don't have very much. Potentially it could just be, you know, the value of it wiped off like that.
And we need, you know, societally, we need homes. We don't have enough. It's much better to go up than out, especially in cities. So we need to build high. So we're going to build flats. So we need to have an ownership structure for them that is equitable, does encourage people to put their money into it and to invest into them and keep them maintained. And I think most people, I think, look at a service charge quite rightly and say, well, that's for paying for the communal electricity. And yes, well, the corridors will need to be painted every so often. And, you know, hopefully not too often, but occasionally we're going to need to maintain the lift, or we're going to certainly need to replace it at some point, because consumable maintenance, wear and tear. We can put a trigger on it. We can put money into a sink fund. So we've got the collective. I don't think anybody ever went into this thinking, do you know what? I better put half the value of the flat to one side just in case we need to rip the face off it prematurely and replace it.
Most of us don't have that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I also recognize that I'm in a much more fortunate position than many others at the moment. I mean, I don't know the extent yet of what we're looking at with this building, but right now we don't have a waking watch. I have a roof over my head. I can afford the mortgage, you know, and there are many people who don't have that and have not had access to that, or have bought into shared ownership, you know, and struggled to get there, have a young family, thought they were doing the right thing at the time, were really encouraged to do that, and just feel completely let down, I imagine.
Yeah, whichever way you look at it, yes, there's a huge betrayal of trust, I think, that that is perpetuated. And I think getting to the bottom of the multiple layers of betrayal, if you like, or failure that is slowly dripping out through the Grenfell inquiry, but then still most of that relates and is pertinent to the circumstances around Grenfell. So if we're talking about insulation manufacturers, there are two that are being discussed and forensically analysed during the Grenfell inquiry. We're not talking about the other 5 or 10 that weren't on the Grenfell Tower, but may well have been operating in exactly the same way. So I think we have to look at that failing and say, what are we going to do to put this right? How are we going to make people safe, not just make them feel safe, which is one of the...
Absolutely. And it is, as you say, it's a question of trust. And when you think how long it's taken, you know, the tragedy of Grenfell and the huge impact that it had, and that we're now 3.5 years on, and with people are still in terrible situations, and things are being uncovered all the time in terms of malpractice or profiteering at the expense of safety, and not, you know, legislation and regulations not being looked at it's appalling. It's really shocking, actually, that it takes that long.
And I don't think many people would have considered this as a possibility 4 years ago, 3.5 years, you know, just prior to Grenfell. I mean, I think that the penny started to drop after that. You know, I think for a lot of people to say, well, I'm in a flat. Could this happen in my building? That kind of question. But I think prior to that point, there had been, there was Lacanal House disaster in 2009, but again, it didn't meet public consciousness in the way that Grenfell did, obviously because of the scale of the loss of life and the news media, rolling news media and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, genuinely, I don't think anybody would expect in a country like this that the system would allow an unsafe home to be built.
No,
managed.
No, I mean, fundamentally, that's what it comes down to, right? You just go,
Yeah.
how did we get here? You know, and how do people who've been, you know, part of those decision-making processes actually, how do they sleep at night knowing that they've been responsible for those things?
Yeah. And there has been, behind the scenes, prior to all of this, campaigning going on and lobbying going on and whistleblowing, call it what you like, of people in the industry that have known that these problems were on the way. And you see some of that in the Grenfell inquiry. But actually that's entirely different to making that cut through into the mainstream, which is sort of where we're getting to now in terms of the awareness of this problem. So you are a lone voice in the wilderness, if you like, because unless that thing that you're predicting happens, it's almost sort of in the realms of conspiracy theory. It's just unknown. I mean, how can an individual make that story land against industry lobbies and government, et cetera, et cetera? So you almost have to wait and then say, well, we told you this was going to happen. Why didn't you listen to us? The warnings. But I think history is littered with prophecies of things that were going to happen and that have been ignored. So there is no sense of sort of schadenfreude now to say, well, told you this was going to happen, because that benefits no one. It's just sad and frustrating, I think, for everybody that's involved to think, if you'd have listened to me, maybe this could have been averted. But, you know, I think now we need to try and move into solutions. How are we going to fix this issue? But we're still arguing about semantics and who pays and tactical issues like that are important, rather than saying, by Christmas, how are we going to make sure that everybody's living in a safe home? What's the plan for the next 12 months, 24 months? What is it? And where does your building fit in that timeline in comparison to others?
And, you know, living with the anxiety of actually at any point you might get stung with an enormous bill for remediation work that, as you say, you had no idea at the time you bought was ever going to be a reality. And the anxiety of that financially on a day-to-day basis is enormous. I mean, that takes a huge toll, as if at a time when everybody's living in under huge anxiety and stress and instability, just because of the situation that we're all in, of course, exacerbated by the fact that everybody is literally trapped in their own homes.
Yeah. And I think if government could just draw a line, you know, if there was a way of them sort of saying, well, look, you know, there's an indemnity there that 80%, 90%, you know, the maximum exposure that you have will be X. So that if in your head was 100,000, it's now 10 or whatever the number is. It's still I know it's not right that there's any amount of money is too much, but just something that would, I think, give people the reassurance that they're indemnified to a degree, and we can all work together on making those buildings safe. Because one of the difficult conversations I have with people a lot of the time is they've talked me through their building, and I think there's probably other issues with that building, not just the one they're facing, which is I think we might have had a conversation similar to this, not just the external wall where everyone's focused. And you kind of need all of those systems to work together to keep everyone safe. But similarly, the more holes you poke in the walls, the more bills you start generating. So there's this sort of trade-off between, I want to know I'm safe and I want this building to be right, but then I kind of don't want to know because that's going to cost me a lot more money probably. So is it better that I don't know about it? But there's this tension. I feel because
you're building insurance. Is somebody going to suddenly say, well, okay, you need a waking watch, and all of this, you know, the ridiculous costs of how that is being organized and how those costs are kind of emerging is extraordinary to me. but yeah, and just that moment of actually somebody with the power to do something, you know, somebody at government, ministry level, legislation level, to actually acknowledge that there are a lot of people living in a desperate situation at the moment. Just acknowledging that as much as anything, you know, you get a sense of humanity coming through. I think would make people feel better. But at the moment, there's this still this sense that they're being, you know, this sort of defensive. Well, we put, you know, and then a figure announced, and then, you know, things leak out about what the caveats are against that, and then, you know, all sorts of rumors emerge, and then you start hearing things about what you're, you know, gagging orders and all sorts of things. You just go, oh my goodness, you know, we haven't even got a clear solution on the table, and it's already just getting very, very murky and muddy and unpleasant, and doesn't
Well,
seem a good
to
way
me,
to solve anything.
it's the kind of posturing you do when you know that you're probably going to be facing legal claims in the future. So you're doing things not to prejudice
Mm-hmm.
yourself in the future. And I think, you know, ultimately that's probably where all this is leading. I hope it doesn't, but we've got a lot to come out in Module 6 of the Grenfell inquiry, you know, where the role of government is looked at in the context of Grenfell. Where they'll be looking at the building regulations and when did things change and what were you allowed to, you know, all that sort of stuff. Unfortunately for the leaseholder community, that's probably not going to see the light of day until this time next year, depending on all the COVID delays and people not attending and having to be empty chaired and all that sort of stuff. So that's phased in after the fire safety bill and the building safety bill votes, or the legislation should have gone through the Commons. So it's really bad in the sense that I don't think we'll have the full picture of liability if you look at it like that, until after those bills have gone through Parliament. Right. I guess we just have to work with what we've got and hope that firstly the MPs do the right thing when the fire safety bill amendment comes back, as a first point of sort of putting a line in the sand to say, no, we should not be pushing this onto leaseholders. They need to be indemnified. Now, there's a lot of detail behind that would need to be worked up in terms of, well, what is the mechanism for paying? And it's not a perfect solution, but I think as a statement of intent to say, you know, we're voting this down, or voting for this amendment. So I just hope another 20 or so Conservative MPs do the right thing. I think
it's gathering a bit of momentum, isn't it?
Yeah, it's still going to be tough, I think, for everyone that's sort of coming forth and doing the right thing. There's probably 5 or 6 that are sending out ridiculous emails to their constituents saying, you know, I've spoken to the government minister and he or she assures me that everything will be fine.
Yeah, right.
Love and kisses, your local MP. Which
I haven't heard back from my local MP yet.
Well, no, I think it's completely unreasonable, I think, for even to not get a reply or even grasp the scale of the. I can understand if you're an MP in a very rural constituency that maybe has one block of flats in it. I can understand how you might not be fully across the situation, but I think if you're representing a constituency in somewhere like London or Leeds or Liverpool, I mean, it would be outrageous to think they haven't got hundreds of constituents or thousands with this.
Exactly. Yeah, who are going to be directly or indirectly impacted, of course. Yeah.
It's a very strange psychology, and you sort of think, well, what are you doing every day that's more important than this? Okay, there's COVID and there's Brexit and going on. But I would have thought, as a constituency issue, it's got to be up there in the top 3.
Yes.
So strange. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us. That's been really great, and we'll put your Twitter handle on the bottom of the screen so anybody can get in touch with you and take a look at some of your work. And thank you very much for taking the time to join Building Safety Faces.
A pleasure. Thank you, Matt.
No worries.